5? Okay. So, for those of you who haven't seen me, I should probably briefly introduce myself. Edgar Erdfelder is my name. I'm a professor of cognitive psychology at the University of Mannheim in Germany. And I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to the first One World Cognitive Psychology seminar ever, an online research colloquium with international guest speakers that we're willing to share with all interested people in the world. I very much hope that you will like this event, and if you like it, please tell it to all your friends and colleagues so that maybe in the next weeks we will have even more participants than we have today. Now, before we come to our guest speaker today, let me briefly introduce my colleagues from the Mannheim Cognition Group that were fortunately willing to co-organize this seminar series jointly with me. These nice people are, in alphabetic order, Arndt Bröder. I hope everyone can see him right now. Okay, Maike Kroneisen. And last but certainly not least, my colleague Beatrice Kuhlmann. We've previously decided that we will share responsibilities in these meetings. So one person will always be kind of a moderator, moderating the research colloquium, and at least one other person will take care for organization and technical issues. So as you might guess, today, my role is the moderator role, and the role of the person responsible for technical issues is Bea Kuhlmann's role. And that brings me to asking Bea whether she is willing to explain the rules and regulations of our Zoom meetings briefly.
Yes. Welcome, everyone. We are 139 participants. That's exciting. We do have to implement some restrictions. Probably most of you have heard that there's some ugly Zoom bombing going on, and also for, to keep the connection steady and to make sure that we hear Dan and we don't hear everyone else what is going on in their apartment. So you've all been muted and you can't unmute yourself. But we do want this to be interactive, and we do want you to ask questions, and then I will grant you permission to speak. So all you have to do for that is use the raise your hand feature from Zoom, which means you're virtually raising your hand. You don't actually physically raise your hand. We actually would prefer that you keep your video off because that helps keep the connection more stable. But so to do this, what you need to do is at the bottom in the options, you have the participants tab. It might be displaying in your language. And if you click on that, at the bottom of the list of participants, you should find these options. And there is the option raise your hand that is marked here. And so you can use that. It will bump you up on my list, and then I can actually call on you. And I did speak with Dan beforehand, and he encourages questions throughout the talk. So you don't have to wait until the end. If you have a question, raise your hand. I will let Dan know that there is a question, and then we'll call on you. It's up to you whether you want to turn your video on during questions. We actually think that might be nice as an interactive part. Do note that we will be recording the session, so keep that in mind when deciding whether to turn on your video during question and interaction with Dan or not. And also note that there's some other reactions you might want to use throughout the talk to let Dan know that you're there, that you're hearing him. In the reactions little button there, you have, for example, the option to show a clap or show a thumbs up. Do use these as you wish, but the raise your hand is the one that signals to me that you want to speak and that I should call on you. Okay, back to Edgar.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. So maybe we should briefly ask, is there an urgent technical question right now? So then you should raise your hand immediately, but if it's not, I think we should just go on. Do we have any urgent questions, Bea?
It doesn't seem to be the case.
Very good. So that means we should do what we are supposed to do right now, listen to a colloquium talk. Our first speaker in our seminar series is Daniel Bernstein from Kwantlen Polytechnic University in British Columbia. So there are definitely many reasons why Dan Bernstein is the right person to begin this seminar series. I will not list all the reasons why he's the right person. What I will do is mention just one reason, which is actually linked to the reason why we launched this seminar series recently. So now it's end of April, beginning of May. That's the time where Dan Bernstein was supposed to be a guest professor at Mannheim University. So he was supposed to be with us, doing research with us, doing teaching with us, and collaborating. And all that has become impossible because of the COVID-19 crisis. And that's, of course, frustrating. I mean, people like us who like science, we enjoy collaborating and discussing science. They're simply frustrated. So we thought about options, how to get out of this dilemma. And one way is how to try to keep contact on online channels. And then the idea came up to have our usual research colloquia online. And that's the reason why we actually started this series. So thank you, Dan, in the very beginning for giving us a reason to invent these things that we probably would not have invented without your, well, canceled research visit here in Mannheim. But having said that, a few words also about our speaker and his academic background in the beginning. So Dan Bernstein received his education as a psychologist at the University of California, Berkeley, where he finished his honors bachelor degree. Later went to Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario in Canada to finish his master degree in behavioral neuroscience. And finally went to Simon Fraser University in Vancouver for his PhD in cognitive psychology, which he finished under the supervision of Bruce Whittlesey. That shows a little bit about his background in these years. So a lot of things, of course, have happened in the 20 years that followed his dissertation. He had a lot of positions, not only at Kwantlen, where he's now affiliated, but a lot of adjunct positions at University of Washington, University of British Columbia, Simon Fraser University, not to mention a lot of guest professorships and guest visitings all around the world. So Dan is really a person who is collaborating with many scholars worldwide. And that's another reason why he is the right person to start this seminar series here. Among the very well-known scholars he has been collaborating with was Jeffrey Loftus, Elizabeth Loftus, and Andy Meltzoff, to name just a few. Dan continuously published in the leading journals, not only of cognitive psychology, but also developmental psychology, especially lifespan developmental psychology. And he was very successful in acquiring grants, awards, and honors, such as most recently the prestigious Canada Research Chair in Lifespan Cognition that he currently holds. So if we look at the scientific work of Dan Bernstein, we see it's very broad thematically and also methodologically. He used a lot of different research approaches. But despite this diversity, there are two topics that clearly stand out in his career. One topic is more developmental in nature, namely cognitive development across the lifespan, specifically theory of mind development. That's one area. And another big area is more closely linked to cognitive psychology itself, and that's the topic cognitive illusions, or more specifically, memory illusions. And that brings us exactly to the talk we will hear today. As you see on the first slide, the formation and consequences of false memory. There's nothing more left to say for me than the floor is yours. I'm looking forward to your talk.
My home, giving you a talk that I've never thought I'd be giving from my home, but hopefully this will work without hitch. Okay, let's see if this works. It doesn't so far. Good. Okay. So let's start with some context. In 1984, an assailant broke into Jennifer Thompson's apartment and sexually assaulted her. The assailant then repeated this with another woman later that night. The 22-year-old Thompson studied the perpetrator's face while he assaulted her. She was trying to pay attention to a detail so that if she survived, she'd be able to help the police catch him. And this is something that you hear, maybe not often, but you do hear from victims of assault, that they're trying to study the face of a perpetrator so that they can identify the perpetrator later. Cal Johnson was convicted of rape, and the evidence used was that Thompson was 100% sure as an eyewitness, and many of you might know that very confident witnesses are believed much more than the underconfident witness. And a 100% confident witness is almost always believed. 4 women identified Johnson in court, despite 2 of 4 people identifying him in a lineup, 2 of 4 of the women. The photo used in the lineup showed Johnson cleanly shaven, but Johnson had a full beard when the rape occurred. Johnson maintained his innocence and was finally exonerated by DNA evidence at age 41. And he had served 10.5 years in prison. We're going to return to that case at the end of the talk. So the talk is very simple. I'm going to first discuss the formation of false memories, how false memories arise, and then I'll talk about the consequences of false memory, and then finally conclusion. But this is a very lopsided talk because the majority of my time is going to be devoted to the formation of false memories rather than the consequences. So with no further ado, we will jump right in. We'll start with a fact about memory. Memory is malleable and reconstructed. It preserves gist, kind of the overall meaning of an experience quite well, but the details not so well. Now, in 2001, Giuliana Mazzoni and colleagues posited that false memory arose really through a process of 3 independent and then linked processes. One was plausibility, and that had to come first. A person comes to view an event as generally plausible. And afterwards, the person comes to believe that the event personally occurred. And finally, the person interprets thoughts or fantasies about the event as memories. Now, you may note that there's a difference between the word believe here and the word memory here. And that's important because the second and third process here are actually, they differ based on whether somebody believes something occurred but can't actually remember it in any episodic detail. And then you have memory, where the person has to come to remember with episodic detail that the event occurred. Now, a few years later, I and Elizabeth Loftus, who has joined us, hi Beth, glad to see you, and graduate student Ryan Godfrey posited 2 additional steps to this formation of false memory. And the first step was fluency, the speed with which we process information. And fluency then is followed by familiarity, feeling of familiarity. And this is the feeling that you've experienced something prior. You might come to think, I've seen this, I know this, I've experienced this before. And we believe that those 2 processes actually precede the 3 processes that we described prior: the plausibility, autobiographical belief, and autobiographical memory. Okay, now, if we unpack what we mean by this process fluency leading to familiarity, this is a brief schematic of how that might work. Now, fluency often in the literature is taken to be the speed with which you process information. And we didn't argue that it was simple speed of processing, but that it was surprising fluency. And this is actually an idea that came from Bruce Whittlesey's work, Whittlesey and Lisa Williams, who was a graduate student at the time that I was also a graduate student. And Whittlesey and Williams proposed that it's not fluency per se, but it's the surprising fluency that makes the difference. And they called it discrepancy. It's a discrepancy between what you expect your processing experience to be and what your actual processing turns out to be. That surprising fluency leads to a feeling of familiarity where you might say, I know this. That then leads to a process of source monitoring where you ask yourself, why do I know this? Why does this feel familiar to me? And that's a difficult step, because you have to distinguish all potential sources of familiarity to detect the right source. Why do I know this? Why does this feel familiar to me? And that source monitoring then leads to a misattribution to the personal past, where you say, oh, it feels familiar to me because it must have happened to me. So yes, it happened. Okay. Here again is the schematic, and we're actually going to leave the territory of fluency and familiarity and plausibility, and we're going to focus entirely on autobiographical belief and autobiographical memory from here on. But I'm happy to return to notions of fluency and familiarity at the end for questions. Okay, now, I am not going to distinguish between belief and memory from this point on, but there is a distinction drawn in the literature, and it's an important distinction. I'm going to lump them together, and I'm going to use the terms interchangeably. But they are believed to be different processes in the formation of false memories. Okay. And that's what I just said. Good. So let's talk about some techniques or procedures that are used to elicit false memories. Two very well-known techniques. One of them is the Diess-Roediger-McDermott paradigm, and the second one is misinformation, which was brought to you by Elizabeth Loftus and colleagues. We'll start with the DRM paradigm. Many of you are probably familiar with this. I simply want you to read the words that are on the screen. I'll give you a moment to do that. Okay, and then I'm going to simply ask you, you don't have to vote, but I want you to note to yourself which of the following words you remember reading from the slide prior. Pin, sewing, point, prick, needle, injection, knitting. Now, many of you probably identified many of these words. And some of you, if not many of you, also probably identified one of the words as being on the list when in fact it was not on the list, and that word is needle. So needle was actually not presented prior, but it is associated semantically in a meaningful way to all of the words on the list, and it's highly associated with all of the words on the list. Now, this kind of illusion or memory illusion elicits very high false memory rates, often over 50% of the time. You can elicit it via recognition, which is what we just did, or via recall, where I simply present a word list like I did, and then ask you to recall all the words that you can on that list. Okay, so now we're going to move to misinformation. Misleading information presented after an experience often makes people misremember details of the experience. In one of the first demonstrations of this, Loftus, Miller, and Burns showed participants slides of an accident. I'm going to use big P throughout the talk, sometimes with a little S next to it, and that's simply participants, so I don't have to say that garbled word. Okay, so here is an actual slide from the original slide sequence used by Loftus, Miller, and Burns. Participants might watch a slide sequence of a red car, in this case a Datsun, passing through an intersection. And in this case, what's critical is that there's a stop sign at the intersection. And subjects might see this slide. They might also see a slide, another group of subjects might see the same slide, except that the stop sign is now a yield sign. It's the only difference in the two slides. But this is a slide sequence. So, so the Datsun turns right after the intersection, and then eventually hits a pedestrian in an intersection. And the question posed is later on. So half of the participants are asked, how fast was the red Datsun going when it passed the stop sign? Now that's a true event. They saw the Datsun pass through the intersection via a stop sign. Now the other half of the participants are asked, how fast was the red Datsun going when it passed the yield sign? They were not shown a yield sign, so this is a false event. And simply through the process of suggesting that there was a yield sign instead of a stop sign at the intersection, participants often come to misremember that there was a yield sign. So most of the participants who receive this misinformation incorrectly report that the car passed a yield sign. And this even occurred when people were asked to choose between a stop sign, a yield sign, or a one-way sign. So we might ask, what happened to the memory? And this is a debate that actually continues to this day. When I was a postdoc at University of Washington, I once attended a talk, and Beth, I don't remember if you were still there, because Beth moved from University of Washington to UC Irvine in California, and I stayed in Seattle at the University of Washington. Anyway, there was a talk given by Tony Greenwald. And Tony Greenwald, he was interested in these questions that are basically, that have been unresolved in psychology, and he thought would never be resolved. And this was one of them. According to Tony Greenwald, we'll never resolve this question. But this is an interesting question that we should ask. What happened to the memory? Now remember, the Datsun passed a stop sign. The people who saw that were then were asked via question and there was an insinuation made that it was a yield sign. The participants then later misremember that there was a yield sign instead of a stop sign. That's the misinformation effect. Now, what happened to the memory for the stop sign? Is it still in those participants' brain, or is it gone? And one way we could look at this is that, and Elizabeth Loftus looked at it this way, that there's a memory impairment, that the post-event misinformation, the yield sign in this case, actually overwrites the memory of the stop sign, and that stop sign is no longer in memory. What's there is the yield sign. Another way to look at it, and this was posited by McCloskey and Zaragoza, is that maybe the participants weren't paying all that close attention to the stop sign, and so they didn't encode it all that well. And also, we know that this paradigm uses what's called retroactive interference, that when you find out something now that contradicts something that you knew prior, what you know now actually interferes with what you knew prior. And now you have two pieces of conflicting information in memory, but it's very difficult to access the original memory trace because of retroactive interference due to, in this case, the yield sign, which is the newer piece of information. But importantly, McCloskey and Zaragoza argued that the stop sign, the original memory trace, is actually still there. That is a possibility. We're not going to resolve that debate, and hopefully, well, maybe one of you will. It'd be great if you did. It's an important debate. Okay, so we've been talking thus far about false memory for details, and now we're going to move to discuss false memory for entire events. And this is something that we like to call rich false memories. Not just memory for detail, but actual memory for an entire event, full-blown memory. I'm going to talk about 4 techniques used to elicit these rich false memories. One is imagination inflation, which we'll talk about first, and then we'll talk about what's called the revelation effect. We'll then discuss fake photographs, and finally, false autobiographical suggestion. Okay, imagination inflation. This is a study that was done by Marianne Gary while she was a postdoc working with Elizabeth Loftus at the University of Washington. Session 1, participants rate childhood life events. These are events that could have happened to anybody in childhood. You had a lifeguard pull you out of the water. You won a stuffed animal at a carnival game. You gave someone a haircut. You broke a window with your hand. Now, at session 1, participants are giving ratings on a confidence scale, how confident they are that each of these events happened to them before the age of 10. Session 2, 2 weeks later, participants imagine some of the events. So you had a lifeguard pull you out of the water, and the instructions are, imagine that this event actually happened to you and what it would have been like, what it would have felt like, and try to imbue the imagination with as much sensory detail as you can. Won a stuffed animal at a carnival game. So same thing. Imagine what this event would have been like. Even if you can't remember it, try to imagine it. And then afterwards, participants are asked to re-rate all life events. Now, in the original study, Gary and colleagues told the participants, we lost your session 1 ratings, and there was a glitch, and we need you to re-rate all of those events. And there was no instruction given to give the same rating that you gave the first time around. Simply do your best to rate all of these events. And I don't know if that instruction actually matters. You can just simply tell people to re-rate the events, as we've done in other studies, and you get basically the same kind of effect. Anyway, what Gary and colleagues noted was that imagination inflated confidence that the events had occurred in childhood. So where you were underconfident that an event happened prior, or let's say that you were confident that the event did not happen at session 1 when you were asked, you had a lifeguard pull you out of the water. Now you can't remember this happening. And so you say on a scale from 1 to 8, where 1 is that it definitely did not happen, yeah, maybe 2. I'm pretty sure it did not happen. Well, after you imagine that it happened, you might come to give that same event a rating of a 4 or a 5. Now closer to the, yeah, it definitely did happen range of on the scale. Okay, and that is imagination inflation. Note that process or procedure takes 2 weeks, and it's quite laborious to run a study like that. So what we did, it was worked with something called the revelation effect, which is an odd memory illusion that many of you are probably not familiar with. And it's simply something that happens when you have to involve yourself in elaborating on a word, typically using a word list in these studies. You have to elaborate on a word that you might have studied prior, and you're asked, did you see this word prior? And often what's used in this study, so it's a standard recognition paradigm originally by Watkins and Painter-Cholo in 1990. You read a list of words, and then you're tested on the words later on. Half of those words are actually anagrams, so the letters have been rearranged. And you have to unscramble the letters to form a word. And then you have to say whether you studied that word. And what Watkins and Painter-Cholo observed was that the act of unscrambling the word led people to believe that they had studied the word prior. So it led to this feeling of familiarity. Yeah, I saw this word prior. I studied it. And we used a similar procedure with childhood life events. Sip time. Okay, so we had our participants rate life events, and half of those events were intact, You might see something like broke a window playing ball. But other times you would see the event with a keyword scrambled. So in this case, you might see broke a DWNIWO playing ball. And you weren't given both of these, but you were given one version of this. But half of the events were intact, half of the events were scrambled. And what we observed was that participants were more likely to claim that an event happened in their childhood after unscrambling a keyword in the life event. And this happened in seconds rather than 2 weeks. It was a very quick procedure to elicit a false memory illusion. That people become more confident that the event happened in their childhood simply by unscrambling a word in that target event. The effect also occurs for belief, which I won't be talking about, but remember that the hypothetical model for the formation of false memories included this step about plausibility, coming to believe that an event happened in your personal past. And you could use a technique like this perhaps to elicit feelings of familiarity and belief. So we asked people a series of trivia questions in the same study in 2002. You give people something like fastest land animal, and then the target word answer, in this case, is scrambled, and it's the word leopard. And when you unscramble it, you're more likely to believe that that is the correct answer, when in fact, it's not the correct answer. The cheetah is the fastest animal. So sometimes you would see cheetah, sometimes you would see leopard as the answer, and sometimes that answer was scrambled, and sometimes it was intact. Okay, so moving on to fake photographs. This is work by Kim Wade and Marianne Gary and Don Reed and Steve Lindsay from 2002. Now, this is a wonderful procedure where participants are contacted by the experimenter and asked for a phone number for a parent and or a guardian. And the experimenter then calls the parent and asks the parent a series of questions about, let's say, Johnny, who is on the right side of your screen, the little Johnny, who's now age 18 and is a participant in the experiment that you're going to be conducting. So you're going to ask the parent of Johnny, can you tell me about the following events? Did this happen? Did this happen? Did this happen? And critically, you ask the parent, did Johnny ever take a hot air balloon ride with his father when Johnny was a little boy? And the parent says, no, I can guarantee that didn't happen. And you say, thank you, that's great. Would you mind sending me a picture of Johnny and Johnny's father from the time that Johnny was, let's say, 6 or 7 years old, or 4 or 5 years old? The parent does. So now the experimenter has a picture of Johnny and Johnny's father, and via Photoshop places Johnny and Johnny's father in that hot air balloon and shows this to subjects. And subjects are asked, did this ever happen to you in your childhood? And the participant can't remember it at first, but here has photographic evidence that contradicts his or her memory of the event. And that is a difficult situation to find yourself in. You can't remember this event ever happening, but you've got photographic evidence. There's cute little you with your father in that hot air balloon. It must have happened. Well, in fact, about 50% of participants come to claim this as a memory after seeing a picture of themselves that falsifies their own actual memory. So it leads to a false memory for the event. Okay, and now we're going to move on to false autobiographical suggestion. This is a procedure that was developed by Elizabeth Loftus and Jackie Pickerel, who was a graduate student at the time. And this is the same kind of procedure that Kim Wade and colleagues used in their fake photograph study, except Loftus and Pickerel did not use photos. So participant is told the truth that a parent said, here are some things that happened in your childhood. You rode a pony at your 6th birthday party. You broke a tooth on a piece of hard candy. You got chewing gum stuck in your hair. Now, this should all feel familiar to the participant because, in fact, all of these things happened. And the parent actually verified to the experimenter that these are things that happened in my child's childhood. But critically, the participant is told falsely that the parent said, you got lost in the mall when you were a child. And we want you to try to remember this, just like you might have an instruction in therapy. If you can't remember something at first, you might try to remember it. And using this procedure, Loftus and Pickrell observed that people were pretty accurate at remembering the true events. Let's see if here we go. So people are up at 70% for the true events. These are 3 consecutive interviews, 1 week apart. But what you notice is that people are pretty confident that the event happened that didn't happen, that they got lost in the mall as a child. So 30% of participants start believing this at interview 1, and that really only levels off to 25% by the 3rd week, 3rd interview. Using the same procedure, Ira Hyman and colleagues asked people about a different target event, in this case, a wedding accident, that you were at a wedding as a child and you were running and you spilled punch on the bride's parents. And do you remember this? And using this same procedure, Hyman and colleagues again identified very high memory for the true events and upwards to 20-25% of false memory for this wedding accident, an event that did not happen in your childhood, but you come to believe that it happened. And now, importantly, in this study, Hyman and colleagues observed no false memory in interview 1, but that then rose to about 20% by interview 2 and 25% by interview 3. Okay. And a technique that's used in these studies is to try to get the subject to elaborate on the memory. So try to remember the event as best you can. And after that elaboration, what you often will observe is participants coming to believe that something happened that didn't happen. And they'll tell you quite a lot of episodic detail about something that happened. In this case, a participant says, I do remember her, an elderly lady, asking me if I was lost, asking my name, and then saying something about taking me to security. Well, this is a false memory, but it's quite detailed. Okay, so we've been talking about rich false memories and different procedures that are used to elicit false memories. And what we might ask is whether all false memories are created equal or whether all false memories are, in fact, the same thing. Are we talking about the same thing when we use these different procedures to elicit false memories? And I would say the answer to that is no. And I'm gonna show you some data to back up that assertion. So this is a study that I conducted with the late Alan Scaboria and colleagues, where we asked a question that others had asked prior. What is false memory? Well, it's remembering something that never happened. Everybody will agree on that. And there are 3 popular false memory techniques. We've discussed all 3 of these so far. The DRM, the Diess-Roediger-McDermott, misinformation, and false autobiographical suggestion. Now, we used all 3 of these procedures in our study, and we simply asked whether these 3 procedures produced effects that correlated with each other. And you might assume that if these 3 procedures elicit what are called false memories, and false memories are the same thing in these 3 procedures, that these 3 effects should correlate. That was our logic, and that was the logic used by many others who had asked a similar question. I guess going back to 2008 was the first study that we could find on this, where people used these procedures. So FAS here is false autobiographical suggestion, DRM and misinformation. And you'll see that across the board, there are very few positive correlations or significant correlations between these effects using 2 different procedures. any two procedures of these three. You'll also note that some of these studies are woefully underpowered, but importantly, the one that is well powered by Zhu and colleagues, and Elizabeth Loftus was on that study. That study did observe a correlation between misinformation and DRM, but it was a very modest correlation. I think it was below 0.15. I think it was 0.14 or something like that. So not a lot to. It was less than that. Yeah, I mean it was not impressive, and we replicated the unimpressiveness of that correlation in this study. So now I'm going to take a moment to discuss psychometrics. This is something that all of us should be more aware of, and we should be more worried about in our work, especially if you're ever going to try to correlate two measures. Now, we know that unreliable measures tend not to correlate with each other. And if they do correlate, they're doing it basically by chance. We also know that the more items you have in a measure or a scale, the greater your internal consistency or internal reliability tends to be. And arguably the most ecologically valid false memory technique, which we would argue is the false autobiographical suggestion, where you get people to try to believe something happened that didn't happen. That, although it's ecologically valid, because it might be used in therapy, it might occur via talking to friends, talking to parents, talking to siblings, where somebody suggests something to you that never happened. This kind of thing happens all the time in the world. So we would say it's ecologically valid, but it's probably not very reliable, because we tend to study a single item, and maybe two items. And if you go to the second point here, the more items you have, the more internal reliability. So the flip side is the fewer items you have in your measure, the less your internal reliability tends to be. Now, there are some ways of measuring internal reliability for a single item scale. I won't get into it because I actually don't understand it. But people do use, they do calculate internal consistency and other forms of reliability on single item scales. But the whole point here is that psychometrics matters. We should pay attention to reliability and validity. Validity is that what you're measuring measures what you think it measures. So if you are using the DRM to measure false memory, to elicit false memory, you hope that it is ecologically valid, and that it's valid, period, that it's measuring false memory. It's eliciting something that's real, a false memory in this case. Okay, so we used a three-part procedure. This is a very involved, difficult. I would not recommend that you do this at home. This is the kind of study that I will hopefully never have to do again. But we did it. So week one, participants come into the lab. They complete a series of questionnaires. In this case, food preferences, childhood experiences, individual differences. A week later, participants return to the lab and they complete a misinformation task, a false autobiographical suggestion task. They then complete the food preferences and childhood experiences again. And then in week three, they do a DRM. Now, week two, critically, what happens during the false autobiographical suggestion is we get people to try to remember an event that most likely didn't happen in their childhood. So we use two groups, an experimental and a control group. And we use lopsided groups here because you want as many people in your experimental group as possible to observe a shift in people's belief that the event happened to them. And so we tend to ratchet up our experimental groups versus our control groups. In this case, more than 3 times as many people in the experimental condition. So the experimental group is exposed to personal report by experts. It's highly likely that you got sick from eating peach yogurt in childhood. The control subjects have no exposure to this report of peach yogurt. And we use 2 items, minimum 2 items per scale in this study. Misinformation, We gave an original slide sequence, 50 slides per sequence, and there were 2 events. So one event had 50 slides. So you might see originally that there were $1 bills, but you're then given misinformation that examined the bills and saw that they were $20 bills. And then you're asked later at memory test, what type of bills were these? And there were 24 misleading items in the misinformation paradigm. And then in our DRM task, we gave 30 15-word lists. This is an entire hour of testing on just the DRM. So you get a 15-word list of all of these words that are semantically associated to a word that is not presented, in this case, the word sleep. And you immediately have to recall the list of 15 words. And then after you do all 30 of these lists, you get a recognition test. And you have to remember as many of the words that you saw prior. Okay, so our internal consistency, our internal reliability was adequate, not great, but adequate for all 3 measures that we were interested in. And DRM, we gave both recall and recognition. It doesn't really matter which we use. But importantly, what we were interested in is correlating these measures and the effects that those measures elicited. So does false autobiographical suggestion lead people to believe that they had this experience of peach yogurt falsely? And does that false memory correlate with the false memory that we observe in misinformation? And does that correlate with the false memory that we observe in the DRM paradigm? Simple question. And then at the bottom is a latent construct that we did not observe directly, and that's false memory. That's what we think all 3 of these paradigms are measuring. And do the 3 techniques correlate? And the answer is not very well. So in this case, yes, we observed a correlation between false autobiographical suggestion and misinformation, but a very meager correlation at 0.15. The false autobiographical suggestion did not correlate with DRM. And finally, the misinformation did correlate with the DRM on the order of 0.13. And I think that's almost identical to Zhu and colleagues' correlation with 432 subjects. But these are not impressive correlations. So what we concluded is that false memories are not created equal. Other people had come to the same conclusion. That these 3 techniques correlate meagerly or not at all. And that led to our paper, False Memory as a Linguistic Convenience. That was a line that Alan Skaboria came up with while we were meeting to discuss our data and what was happening in our data. And as soon as he said that, I said, that's our title. So we went with it. Anyway, okay, so as I promised at the outset, this is going to be a lopsided talk. And I do not have a stopwatch. Bea.
Yes.
Let's see, 9:04. Okay, so I have how long?
You
Half
have
hour?
about 40 more minutes.
Of the talk or in total?
Of the total time.
Okay, okay. So yeah, this part will be faster than the first part. So now I'm going to move on to consequences. So it's easy to create false memories. That's what we just talked about. Some of the procedures might be more elaborate, requiring several sessions separated in time. But as I showed you with the revelation effect, you might be able to do it very quickly in the order of seconds. False memories have real-world consequences. False accusations. We started with Jennifer Thompson accusing Calvin about a rape, and he served 10 years in prison from this false accusation. Can we demonstrate consequences of false memories in the lab? Yes, we can, and that's what we'll talk about next. So this is work that I did with Elizabeth Loftus when I was a postdoc working with her. And the question was simple. Elizabeth Loftus had been working on false memory for a long time, and she had come up with some wonderful procedures. One of those was misinformation, which we talked about. Another was the false autobiographical suggestion. And these procedures elicited false memories quite reliably. But can we demonstrate, and we can demonstrate that in the lab, but can we demonstrate that those false memories have consequences? That you can get people to change their attitudes and behaviors as a result of holding false memory. So in one study, this is work that Elke Gerards in the Netherlands conducted, and Elizabeth Loftus and I were part of this study. Participants completed food history, inventory, and food preferences. So they just rate a variety of foods, how much they like each food. And then session 2, a week later, half of the participants received the false feedback. You got sick after eating egg salad as a child. Participants then complete food history and preferences again and have the opportunity to eat egg salad. And session 3, which was 4 months later, participants return to what they think is a completely different study. It's in a different building, different experimenter, and they complete a taste test. And I'm just going to show you the consequences of forming a false memory for this event. You think you got sick eating egg salad as a child. Does that actually lead you to avoid eating egg salad? And what you see here is at session 2, which is a week after session 1, where you have the false suggestion. So a week later, the controls are eating more egg salad. The white bars are higher than the other bars. So the black bars are people who come to believe and that the event happened, that didn't, this is a false event. And the kind of stippled gray bar is the non-believers. These are people who are exposed to this false suggestion, but they don't come to believe that the event happened. Both of those groups are eating less egg salad at week 2 compared to the controls. But if we move to session 3, which is 4 months later, and subjects are in a different study, you still see that the believers, the people who are exposed to the false event suggestion, and they come to believe that the event happened in their childhood, they're still avoiding egg salad 4 months later compared to the non-believers and the controls. In a study that was published the same year, independently conducted by Alan Scaboria and Juliana Mazzoni, they told their participants that the participants likely got sick from peach yogurt as children, and the participants read a false government health report saying that as children, many individuals were sickened by eating peach yogurt that was contaminated with E. coli. And 1 week after reading this, participants who read the false event ate less peach, strawberry, and cherry yogurt, but equal numbers of crackers. In a follow-up study that I was involved in with Alan Scaboria and Juliana Mazzoni, participants received either personal suggestion, you likely got sick eating peach yogurt as a child, or they got a general suggestion, as I showed you in that prior study by Scaboria and colleagues. This is a government report that it likely happened in childhood, and you were a child during this time, and so it could have happened to you, but there's not a personal suggestion there, it's a general suggestion. And then finally, another group of subjects got both, the personal and the general suggestion. And a week later, or a month later, the participants who received the personal suggestion or both the personal and the general suggestion ate less peach yogurt, but an equal number of crackers. And the take-home message of this study was that it's the personal suggestion that actually drives the effect. The general suggestion is not doing it. It's getting people to believe personally that this happened to them, rather than it could have happened to anybody at this time period. It's the personal suggestion that gets people to form false memories and to avoid, in this case, eating peach yogurt as a result of this personal belief that it happened to you in your childhood. We've tried a variety of different foods and drinks, alcoholic beverages. Some work better than others. In the first study that we did on this, we used hard-boiled eggs and dill pickles, where we told people that they got sick, and we didn't have them eat hard-boiled eggs or pickles, but we gave them a food preference rating, and then another type of questionnaire, which would get at the intention to eat these items. So they imagined themselves at a restaurant and they had to to go through the menu and pick items in the menu that they might want to order. And the people who came to believe that they got sick eating hard-boiled eggs or dill pickles were less likely to choose those items on a menu at a restaurant. We've done it with strawberry ice cream. We tried with potato chips and we could not get it to work. What we could get people to believe that they got sick eating potato chips at one point in their childhood, that they just felt really uncomfortable after eating a bunch of potato chips. But we couldn't get them to stop eating potato chips. So we're not sure exactly why, but we think it has something to do with the novelty of food versus the familiarity of those foods. So it might, this technique might work more with novel foods like strawberry ice cream than with a really common familiar food like potato chips. Or simply people will not give up potato chips no matter what you do to them. And then we also flipped it. We told people that they loved an item in their childhood, in this case, asparagus in one study, or in another study, white wine. The first time you tried white wine, you loved it. And then how much do you want to drink white wine now? And in one study, we gave them the option of a taste test with white wine, and they drank more white wine if they thought they loved it the first time they drank it. Okay, so we're now going to move on to applications of false memory to law, where we know that eyewitness testimony is fallible at best, and ear witness testimony similarly fallible at best. What you think you heard, what you think you saw, may not be what you heard or saw. And now we're going to shift to something a little bit different, and it is what's called truthiness. And this is a term that Stephen Colbert coined, where he argued in jest that this is truth that comes from the gut, not from books, and that we should believe truth that comes from the gut more than we should believe truth that comes from books. And he called that truthiness. And this is work that I did with Aaron Newman and Marianne Gary and Steve Lindsay and Justin Kantner in 2012. That was the first study that we did on truthiness. And the idea here is very simple. You ask people a series of questions that most people don't know the answer to. Macadamia nuts are in the same evolutionary family as peaches. This is a difficult question. Most people don't know the answer to this. Now, critically, we either show that question by itself or accompanied by a picture, in this case, a picture of a peach. And the result is that participants are more likely to claim true when there is a decorative, non-probative photo present. So they're more likely to believe that macadamia nuts are in the same evolutionary family as peaches when they see a picture of a peach. That peach tells you nothing about the truth of this statement. But magically, it makes people believe that the statement is true more, and we call that truthiness after Colbert. In some recent work conducted by Daniel Dirksen for his master's degree, we asked whether this also applies to law. And Dan Dirksen developed these wonderful scenarios. Mr. Eves said the accused grabbed his phone out of his hands and threw it into the duck pond. And participants either saw a picture of a pond or did not. And they were asked, to what extent do you believe Mr. Eves? And you either believe him or you don't believe him. And what we would expect is participants are more likely to believe the witness when there is a decorative, non-probative photo present. So simply by presenting a photo which tells you nothing about the truth of the statement, people come to believe in this case, Mr. Eves more because they see a picture of a pond than when they don't see a picture of a pond. Okay, so some painful real-world applications of false memory. As of April 2020, in the United States, 69% of the people imprisoned due to a crime that they were believed to have committed, they were imprisoned based on eyewitness testimony and later freed on DNA evidence. They served an average of 14 years in prison. 28% of them confessed or admitted guilt. 21 of them were sentenced to death. And if you haven't seen West of Memphis, do so. It's great. And it covers this problem of false identification. Okay, and we're going to end the talk returning to Ronald Cotton. So Jennifer Thompson visited Cotton shortly after Cotton's exoneration, and she went on to say, if I spent every minute of every hour of every day for the rest of my life telling you that I'm sorry, can you ever forgive me? And he did the one thing that I never imagined. He started to cry and he said, Jennifer, I forgave you years ago. Okay, and wonderfully, the two of them published a book together. Went on to be a bestseller, and they went on a national tour describing the book, promoting the book, but also really promoting the problem of false identification and false memory. And so we're going to conclude with a single sentence. This is the kind of conclusion that I like. So in essence, all memory is false to some degree, and that is that. So thank you very much for your attention, and we are ready for questions. So we'll start on this slide so you can see all the wonderful people that I worked with to make this happen. Okay, so
yes, thank you, Dan.
Questions?
Here. I unmuted you so you can clap for Dan. Okay, and as described before, our preference is that you use the raise your hand feature, but I've also enabled the chat, so if you want to type a question, that would also be possible for you, or should also be possible now. Okay, Dan, do you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Ryan Haglander. So I'm going to turn on your audio, Ryan. It's up to you to turn on your video if you want. Okay. And you can talk now.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bernstein, for it's really lovely talk, and thanks to the organizers for organizing this. I had a question about the correlations between the different methods, and whether your point was that the false memories themselves, based on the different methods, are actually stored differently, or there's something fundamental different about them, or just that the procedures are variably likely to induce false memories in different individuals?
Great question. We don't resolve that question in our paper, but we do address it. We think both could be at work. And I don't have, at this point, I don't have a preference of between the two. At the very least, I would say that the three techniques produce false memories differently. And that either could be that they're producing false memories in different individuals, or the processes are completely different. You might get one individual who develops false memories in all three of those paradigms, but the processes are so different that you don't get a correlation among those false memories, right? And the flip side is that they're completely different, and that you're getting different individuals who have, so you might form false memories using the DRM, I might form false memories using the misinformation, and Elizabeth Loftus might form false memories according to the false autobiographical suggestion, and yet we don't individually have formed false memories for the other events. But we can look at our data and see that those who form false memories for one of the techniques often did for the other ones as well. So there was some consistency there. It's just that the false memories didn't correlate in a very impressive way.
Interesting.
Yeah, but the only way to observe a correlation is within the individual, right? So it's what's the likelihood if you formed a false memory for one technique versus another technique? And you would see zero correlation, null correlation, if those didn't correlate at all, or that the different individuals, as you said initially, are forming different false memories altogether. And we don't have an answer to the question.
Okay, thank you.
But a great question.
Okay, so Arndt actually has a question, so I'll call him next. And then I also see that Elizabeth Loftus has a question, so I'll call on her after that. So Arndt?
Yes, thank you very much for this great talk that summarized so much of the evidence on false memories. I have a methodological question, or better, two methodological questions. Namely, first, how did you get the people to believe the personalized information on this peach yogurt stuff? So what was the cover story for this? And another question I had when about the egg salad study, where basically you divided the sample into the believers and non-believers, and then saw different behavioral consequences of both. But couldn't it be that the believers are those people who actually might have had a bad experience with egg salad, or didn't like it in the first place, and then you gave them an explanation, a personal explanation why they don't like it, and so it's rather correlational but not experimental evidence.
Right, good. Okay, first, the personal suggestion. This is and we could use it for egg salad. It doesn't have to be for peach yogurt because it's the same procedure used in the two studies. Here's something that might have happened in your childhood. We think there's good reason to believe. We've got this sophisticated computer program, and we've entered all your data from time one, where you gave us your food preferences, your childhood experiences with individual foods, and a bunch of other things, personality. And we entered all that into a computer, and the computer generated this profile about your early experiences with food. And one of those experiences is that you got sick eating egg salad. And we want you to think about what that might have been like. So that's highly personalized, where the person, in this case, the subject, is led to believe that we have entered all of his or her data into the computer, and the computer very intelligently has generated an individualized report for your experience as a childhood with various foods. Okay, and your second question, whether it's correlational versus experimental, what's the likelihood that the believer avoids egg salad simply because he or she starts being an egg salad hater, right? Is that it, that the person didn't like egg salad to begin with, and we've just given the person a reason to believe that, right? Now, remember that we have food preference ratings from time one. And those food preference ratings tell us how much people like individual foods, including the critical item egg salad. So you might be a subject in this experiment, and you tell us that you are fine with egg salad. At time one, you say, I'm kind of, out of a scale of 1 to 8, I'll give it a 4 or 5. It's okay. But you might also give it a 1. You hate it. But what we notice is that it's the people, it doesn't really matter where you fall on that. If you start at a 1 on that scale, you can't actually go lower than that. But if you start in the middle, and there are a lot of people who start in the middle, you can fall. And a lot of people do fall when they come to believe the event. So we actually do think that it's not simply a matter of giving them a reason to dislike something that they already dislike. It's that they start being either indifferent or liking the food. And after coming to believe that they got sick, they're avoiding the food.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
So next question is Elizabeth Loftus. I turned your audio on.
Thank you, Dan. That was just terrific. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I want to say you told me 8:30, and when I came on at 8:30 California time, you were speaking already. So I don't know what time you actually started or how much I missed, but I'm sorry I missed some of the beginning because it was really great. But really, I want to ask you a question following up on Ryan's question about the different procedures that don't really correlate very well with each other. And even when you manage to get a statistically significant correlation because you have a large number of subjects, so that a 0.12 or something can end up being significant, but really the relationships are pretty null.
Right.
There's an expert witness who testifies in a lot of cases in the United States, who likes to give accusers who are, let's say, suing somebody or helping to prosecute someone for some crime. This expert likes to give the Gudjonsson suggestibility method, which is essentially a misinformation task. So he'll give it to some accuser in an actual case, and he'll find that they don't happen to particularly fall for the misinformation. And then he will declare that their current accusation is likely to be accurate and not a result of suggestibility because they're not particularly suggestible.
Right.
I wonder, this irritates me no end, but how would you, if you were an expert witness trying to challenge that misrepresentation, how would you put it?
Well, that
on, say, your findings and the others that you nicely reviewed.
Oh yeah, yeah. In many studies, in our own and in those other studies, we administer that same suggestibility scale, and it almost never correlates with the susceptibility to form false memories. That sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but it's not diagnostic in any way as a result of that, because it's so inconsistent across studies. I would never use it as a diagnostic measure, because it's not, if it was diagnostic, you would expect it to predict the formation of false memory reliably across studies, and it doesn't.
Thanks.
All right, and Dan, we have some questions in the chat.
Okay.
So I'll guess I'll read them. So the first one is from Simone Staffel, and she's asking, I'm wondering whether false memories can also be elicited during hypnosis.
Yes, they very likely are to be developed during hypnosis. One of my favorite studies that is not often cited, but it should be, because it was published in Science and it was beautifully done by Jane Daiwan and Ken Bowers in the 80s. What they did, they hypnotized participants, and they weren't looking at false memory per se, but they were looking at the reliability of memory under hypnosis. And what they found was that people are much more likely to remember true details under hypnosis, and that might make us all very excited and happy. But they also found that people were just as likely to form false memories. They were just as likely to have false alarms of things that didn't happen. As they were to, so they basically, what Daiwan and Bowers found was that hypnosis changes the criterion for saying that something happened, and it makes you believe that something happened, and you're going to have more hits and more false alarms as a result of it. So yes, hypnosis can be used to elicit false memories.
Okay, and there's another question by Irene, and that's a beautiful last name that I'm not gonna butcher now. Is there any correlation between false memories and age? I mean, do we believe more in false memories when we get older compared to when we were younger?
It's yeah, wonderful question. There is some evidence that as people age, they fall victim to false memory a little bit more often, but it really does depend on the type of false memory. So for instance, the DRM illusion becomes more prevalent in old age. but it's not because the participant is more likely to have a faulty memory. The reason is that the person has a much more elaborate associative network, semantic network, that the person has a better vocabulary than a younger adult. And because of that rich semantic associated network in the brain, the person has much more interference between items. And so when you have items that are all semantically related to a word that's not presented on the list, you just have a lot more interference going on. And the older adult falls more victim to the DRM illusion, not because the memory is poor necessarily, but because the semantic network is actually richer in an older adult versus a younger adult. But then if you use something like the false autobiographical suggestion or misinformation, where you might have more source monitoring at work, which can lead to a false memory. Again, you might see an older adult has more false memory in those two other paradigms, but for a different reason. For false autobiographical suggestion, the person comes to believe something that didn't happen, but can't remember, cannot locate the source of why the event feels familiar now, for instance. There may have been a manipulation. You may have simply suggested to the participant that the event happened. And while source monitoring your memory, instead of saying to yourself, well, the reason this feels familiar to me is because you suggested it to me, you instead say, well, it feels familiar to me because it must have happened to me. And so you might have a false memory formed. So yes, older adults tend to show more false memories than younger adults. They do so for different reasons, and it really depends on the paradigm used to elicit the false memory.
Thank you, Dan. And Maike has a question, so I'll unmute Maike.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. I have a question concerning the fluency idea. I mean, in the beginning of your talk, you told us that it's important that things are fluent to create false memories. But later, you told us for the revelation effect, you need words that are not actually words to create a memory. So it's basically the opposite, I would say. So how can you combine fluency and the revelation effect?
Good, and we did in that paper. What we think is happening, if and I won't go back to the example, but Broca something playing ball, and the word window is scrambled. So the letters appear in different orders, and you have to unscramble those letters. So at first, what you do, you encounter this event, this sentence describing an event, Broca something playing ball. And when you see the word scrambled, you set up an expectation in your mind that this is actually difficult to process. I don't know what this sentence is saying or what it means. And no sooner do you form that expectation, boom, you figure out that it's the word window. And now all of a sudden that sentence has meaning. You broke a window playing ball. And it's that unexpected rush of meaning that we think leads to discrepancy or a mismatch between your expectation of how you thought you would process that sentence and the actual experience you have when you figure out that the word window is what the word was that was scrambled. And so although we use non-words, we use the words that were scrambled to be non-words, you unscramble the non-word to be a real word, and that word has a great deal of meaning. It's a target, a key word in that sentence. And it's that mismatch between your expected processing and your actual processing that leads people to feel familiarity for the event and then misattribute it to their childhood. So that's how we described it in terms of fluency. In this case, surprising fluency.
Thank you.
Okay, and we have another question from Ryan. So Ryan, your audio is on.
Okay, thanks. I hope it's not rude to ask a second question. I wanted to follow up on Dr. Loftus's question about suggestibility. I know John Wickstead has some or presented some evidence that confidence ratings are correlated with the accuracy of memories. Do you also have confidence ratings in the false memories, and can those be correlated between the different procedures? So, even if there are low correlations between the occurrence of false memories based on the different procedures, are there correlations between the confidence ratings when there are false memories based on the different procedures?
We have the data, and I do not know I cannot recall if we did the analysis. Again, really good question. Yes, Wickstead's work, beautiful work, showing that confidence and accuracy can be correlated. What he tends to find is that the correlation holds under high confidence. That you get that correlation when people are highly confident, then it's indicative of accuracy. But in that mid-level confidence, you don't, or low confidence, if you're, I think it's just at the really high end, but it may be at the very low end as well. But in the middle, you don't get it. So if you have a mid-level of confidence, it's not very diagnostic of accuracy. But if you're highly confident, it is diagnostic. We have the data. I can't recall offhand if you get the correlation. I suspect you don't, but I would have to check it.
Okay, and I do see that there's questions in the chat, so I see you guys, but Edgar has also raised his hand, so it's Edgar's turn now first.
Very, very brief question. I'm returning to the issue of how many types of false memories are there. I think it's important to see that it's not a single type, because otherwise one could argue it's just suggestibility. Individual differences in suggestibility explain the variability, and that's obviously not the case. There must be more than that. But that raises the next question: how many different types of false memory are there? I mean, you had 3 measures. You showed that the correlations, the bivariate correlations, were virtually 0 between any pair of ones, right? So what would happen if you add a 4th measure, say truthiness, as a individual difference variable? Would we then have still 0 correlations between all of them? In other words, would there be an additional type of false memory for each additional measure we invest? That would.
Yeah, good question. I don't think it's that bad. But I think we have to be very careful about how we measure anything, in this case, false memory, and the processes that lead to the formation of false memory. Mm-hmm. And if you picked additional measures that tend to involve similar processes leading to the formation of false memory, you might find that those measures correlate with each other better. And the 3 that I used, that others have used as well, tend to involve different processes. Mm-hmm. The DRM is really a semantic illusion. It's a memory illusion that has to do with your semantic memory network. It's not like the other 2, false autobiographical suggestion or misinformation. Misinformation is also different. It's a retroactive interference paradigm. And you learn a list at time 1, that list is then contradicted at time 2, and you've got to remember the original list from time 1, and time 2 is interfering with time 1. It's a different way of measuring what we think is false memory. I don't think it's as bad as what you're suggesting, Edgar, that if you just added different measures, each one would fail to correlate with all the other measures. I really do think that it comes down to, and we have to be very careful to do what's called a task analysis. What is the task doing? And pick tasks that are similar to each other to show that those are correlated. We didn't do that. We picked measures that are high, that are so prevalent that most studies use those measures, and we use those measures interchangeably and argue that they're all eliciting the same thing, i.e. false memory. Well, if they are, they should correlate better, and they're not correlating that well. So we're kind of left with the difficult question: is it that these are 3 different things, or are they all measuring the same thing but in totally different ways? And that's why we fail to correlate them.
Thanks.
Okay, and then there's more questions in the chat. Here's one from Nicholas. Thank you very much for the great talk. I was wondering about the time interval. For example, you said that imagination inflation was found after 2 weeks, Gary, 1995. Do you think it takes longer periods of time until the misinformation gets incorporated in the original memory, or do these longer periods have practical reasons, e.g. that the manipulation is more likely to be noticed shortly after the manipulation? Are there systematic investigations of how false memories, especially misinformation, develop over time?
Yeah, I think, Beth, you devoted a big chunk of your career to that question, didn't you? That there are different time periods. If you think about this really in a simple way, the longer the delay between the original event and the misinformation, the more likely you're going to have forgotten the original event, or you're going to have interference between the original event and other things that could have happened subsequently. The harder it'll be to remember that original event. And the flip side, as you noted in the question, if you present misinformation right after the original event, well then yeah, people should they should be able to see a mismatch, detect the mismatch between the misinformation and the original event. They should be more able to do that in a short delay than a long delay. And the long delay is simply to increase interference and make it more difficult for people to remember the original event.
And if Elizabeth Loftus has anything to add, I've unmuted her. So.
Well, Dan, I guess I would just add to that you can, even with a short interval, get people to fall for the misinformation, but they might be falling for it for a different reason. They might be weighing the two options and then deciding that the misinformer has more authority and I'm going to go with that one because it's probably correct, and they give the misinformation response. So it might involve a somewhat different process, but you still eventually get to the same report. But
right.
could I, since I was just unmuted, go back to Ryan's comment about Wickstead, and or would I be interrupting your flow, which I don't want to do?
No, you had your hand raised too, so.
Well, I did, but then I was sort of removed from Ryan's concern or comment about Wickstead. You know, I just want to add that Wickstead is on this, mission to say that it's as long as a person is highly confident, you don't have to worry about anything else. They're likely to be accurate. They're highly likely to be accurate. But I believe that Wickstead, is ignoring other findings that show that even with very high confidence, under certain other conditions, people are not accurate.
Well, Jennifer Thompson was dead wrong, anecdotally, right? But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I can't remember if she was highly confident to
100% confident.
At the lineup or at her initial identification?
Yeah, I don't remember at the initial.
Yeah, he thinks it's only the initial identification where you need to, if they say they're really confident, you believe them. But anyhow, Chad Dotson has some great, reasonably recent data showing that there are lots of conditions where you're really confident, but you make a lot of mistakes. Right. And so I think people need to be a little careful and hold Wickstead's feet to the fire here and scrutinize carefully what he's saying. And we certainly know that when people fall for misinformation, they're highly confident about their wrong answers.
Right.
That's all I want to add to your answer to Ryan.
Yeah, and just also to point out that in our study where we tried to correlate the three different paradigms, the misinformation paradigm that we used was a single task where the misinformation occurred right after exposure. So it was within a single session. It was not weeks apart or anything like that. So yes, you definitely can get misinformation effect within minutes. You don't have to wait weeks.
Okay. So we have quite a few questions in the chat. Does Edgar, the moderator, want to decide something?
Well, probably too much to finish to answer all of them in that. How many are there? Couldn't you overlook it?
I think there's about 5, and some of them are pretty broad, I would think. But
okay, that means we cannot finish that in the time that we planned for this meeting. Maybe we should keep all these questions and hand it to them. Maybe we can write an email afterwards, or you can have a private 2-person meeting. I think looking at the time, we should finish right now to stay in our framework, our time framework that we planned. We should not finish, of course, without first thanking Dan for this excellent talk once again.
And for this, I would like to try. I'm gonna unmute you all so we can give Dan a proper clap, hopefully.
Yeah.
Or if you're German, you knock on the table, you know. So let's try this.
Bravo.
Well done.
Very good.
All right, that's fair enough.
Well, thank you very much.
And I would like to just announce quickly our speaker next week, same time, same place, but it will be a different Zoom link, which we'll post on our webpage the day off, just to keep the security level. But so next week, we will have Dana Turon present on age and individual differences in skill acquisition, strategy transitions, and memory avoidance. So please do join us for that as well. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great, I think. All right.
Thank you for participating, and see you again next week and the upcoming weeks.